Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and Aviation in the Pacific Week. And we are continuing our look at aircraft. And today we are talking about the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber. And if you're anything like me, your most recent kind of reminder of that aircraft's capability was, of course, the remake or the Midway film. Is it a remake? Is it just another film tackling the same subject? I don't know. Which I actually watched in Arnhem, of all bizarre places. There I was in the middle of the market garden battlefields watching a film about the Pacific. But anyway, that incredible scene, whether you like the movie or not, of the dive bombers coming in there, kind of get an idea of that the G forces, the speed, and it was just kind of mesmerizing, that particular sequence. Some of the rest of the movie I found a bit weird, but there you go. So my guest today, Donald Nijboer, is a Canadian aviation historian who's written numerous books, including one about the Dauntless, and particularly its combat against the Japanese Zero. So without further ado, I will welcome Donald to the show. So good afternoon, Donald. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
So how did you get into the aviation aspect of World War II history? Because there's lots of kind of branches people can get into. What drew you to the battles in the sky?
I blame it on the model glue.
Yep.
That I used when I was building model airplanes as a young boy. I was always fascinated by aircraft from the Second World War. Started building the models, buying the books, begging my parents to watch the movies on TV, staying up late on a school night. So I've always had that passion since I was a kid.
Well, and as have so many people who are watching this show right now, that's the standard route to becoming a historian, I think, is models and comic books and war films and playing World War II in the back garden with your mates. And a whole raft of generations of historians have come that route. So the Dauntless, the dive bombers, I think when most people think about classic aircraft types of World War II, I think Brits think Spitfire and Lancaster. Americans probably would think P-51 Mustang. Maybe they might think about the B-17, the B-24. I don't know that the Dauntless or the dive bombers will generally be in people's top 5, maybe even in their top 10. And yet you're one of the things you kind of are going to point to us tonight is that actually one of the most underrated, underappreciated, and significant kind of war winners that we should be talking about more. Is that kind of what your thrust is today?
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at today, most Americans will recognize the B-17 or they'll recognize the P-51. If you read a lot of the histories, the P-51 that swept the skies of German fighters in the Second World War, and the B-17 was spearheaded the 8th Air Force and bombed Germany, and for the Brits, it's the Lancaster, the Mosquito, and Spitfire. But when you look at the Dauntless and its contribution to the victory in the Pacific, of course, there's probably only I think there's maybe 1 or 2 restored Dauntlesses in the world. I'm not exactly sure, but its contribution and what it achieved in the Pacific towards victory was really quite extraordinary.
And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. So I've put together a bit of PowerPoint. We're going to put up the questions or the points of discussion we're going to discuss today, and we're going to kind of show some photos there. But I mean, the whole thing is, we talked about it yesterday with Ben Kite, and I think a couple of times this week it's come up, this idea of a little bit of kind of difference of opinion within the USA about the Navy and the Army Air Corps about which aircraft type should be dominant and which type of method of going to war should be the way. And the Army Air Corps kind of don't like the dive bomber idea. The US Navy do like the dive bomber idea. I think you could kind of move that kind of basic concept across to the British and Australians as well, because there are difference of opinions there. But the dive bomber, because it was a relatively early technology brought in. I mean, I remember that the dive bomber film, was it Fred McMurray and is it John Wayne in it? I can't remember who's in that one, but they talk about the blackout. But that was in the early 20s, 30s. So give us a little bit of an idea about how kind of the dive bomber kind of started in terms of from the American point of view.
Well, from what I did in my research for the book, the Americans the U.S. Navy did an exercise in, I think, 1926, where they were planning to use a small number of aircraft to act as dive bombers and attack the fleet. And of course, the fleet knew these airplanes were going to be coming, and they were going to devise, some sort of tactics to sort of deal with them. But even though they knew they were coming, the 5 or 10 aircraft that did appear over the fleet and made their dives on the ships completely surprised the boys on the ships. And a few the naval guys started to realize that. They said, geez, you know what, if these guys can sneak up on us and drop a large bomb, then we're in trouble. And the thing with the dive bomber was, it was the only accurate way, the most accurate way you could put a bomb on a target in World War II. And when you look at a ship moving at sea, the dive bomber was the most destructive aircraft in the inventory to do that. Now, the torpedo bomber was a deadly weapon as well, and a torpedo was a definite ship killer, but its tactics had to be worked out precisely so that you could get your torpedo at the ship. Of course, all the Navy brass saw maneuvering at sea as the best way to counter any air attack, and in order to get your ship in your sight, say with a torpedo bomber, you had to have a perfect execution of that. Now with the dive bomber, it could maneuver with the ship as it did its turns and things like that, and you could adjust in the dive to get yourself on target. Where in a torpedo bomber is a little bit more difficult.
I mean, and it's human correction in a dive bomber more so, because if we start going into torpedoes, every nation that used them in World War II, Italian, British, there's problems with fuses, there's problems with the depth of water, there's problems with accuracy, there's problems with them. We could do an entire show just listing the various errors with different types of torpedoes used by the nations. And yeah, as you say, the dive bomber principle is it's pretty basic, isn't it? I mean, it is rough and ready. It's just, there's the ship, dive in and drop a bomb on it, and it relies on courage and that a pilot ability, whereas some other techniques within aviation within World War II rely on kind of gadgetry to be functioning correctly. And as we know, in any show we've tackled on this channel about aviation and technology, most things have a kind of stop-start progression from the drawing board to actual flight, whether it's torpedoes, whether it's bomb sites. There's always kind of a jerky principle there. But we've got some Dauntless lovers have already kind of made some comments in the sidebar there. So your first thing we just said there is that we think it's the most probably the most effective aircraft in the Pacific. And so you're going to give us some data on this, because the way you approach with your writing, and by the way, folks, the links to Donald's book is in the description below. As usual, I recommend you go out there. He's written about other aircraft against aircraft kind of comparisons, Malta and the Pacific and what have you. But you don't just look at pilot testimonies and things. You've been looking at actual raw data. When we get into the Dauntless and the Zeros and their combat record against each other, have you found in recent years that some of the mythology we can now correct and say, you know what, some of these things we used to say, we can now say this because the data says so?
Oh yeah, definitely. One of the big myths is that the Dauntless was credited. Well, the Dauntless, is actually credited with shooting down. I think the figure is 137 Japanese aircraft, 66 being Zeros. And after writing the book, and doing the research, actually that number comes down to around between 7 and 10. I mean, it's basically overclaiming that this is where the culprit is, and so when you think about a Dauntless chasing after a Zero, it's kind of goofy, because the Zero is considerably faster than the Dauntless, and in order for a Dauntless to shoot down a Zero, it would either have to be precisely at the right moment at the right time. Now, having said that, the rear gunners had good chances at shooting down Zeros as well. So they probably had a better chance than, say, the pilot chasing after a Zero. And for most Dauntless pilots, they knew that it was foolhardy to go chasing after a Zero and try to shoot it down. They just didn't have the the performance and or the training to, do an air-to-air kill. And you have to remember that in the Second World War, the U.S. Navy relied on the honor system for, credits, air-to-air credits. So that's a problem. And then the other problem was on Guadalcanal during the campaign between August and February of 43 and starting in 42. They didn't have any paper. It was one of the, basic supplies that, was, put down the list of things that they needed to actually fight the war. So what they did is they cobbled the records after the fact, used memory to sort of put it all together. And also two pilots sometimes saw what they wanted to see. The classic case is Sabaru Sakai. I think I'm pronouncing that right. The famous Japanese ace. He was shot down by Dauntless rear gunners. Of course, all the gunners saw his Zero catch fire and dove away, and they made the claim. And for all the other witnesses, they said, yeah, he was shot down. And of course, as Sakai dove, the flames went out on his aircraft. He managed to fly the 500 miles back to Guadalcanal, severely wounded in the eye and the head. So that's an example of a claim being made, but the actual aircraft not being shot down. So it's quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a nice photo, one of the ones you supplied there on the screen right now. And, if you don't know anything about aviation, but you just look purely aesthetically at aircraft, and there's certain aircraft from World War II that have a very modern look about them. I think the Mosquito does. I think perhaps the P-38 does, the P-61, Black Wit does. I'm being devil's advocate here. When you look at that photo there, it kind of looks 1930s rather than 1940s. I mean, it does look face value a bit antiquated, but and I'm now people are kind of jump on me saying no, it isn't. I'm being devil's advocate here, but you said a little bit yourself a minute ago about it. The pilot can follow the turn of if the ship is turning, or if the ship changes course or changes speed, the pilot can make those calculations. But in principle, give us a couple of reasons why this aircraft was so effective.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I always, as a kid growing up and a young adult reading books, it said, well, at the beginning of the war, Curtiss P-40 was obsolete, the Airacobra was obsolete, and so you have to break down the term, well, obsolete. But in terms of a fighting aircraft, the Dauntless was well designed. It was very rugged. It had a reliable engine. Its bombing performance was exceptional. It was very steady in a dive. The only, I would say, drawback of the Dauntless in its design was they decided not to give it folding wings so that it could carry less on the aircraft carrier. But in order to give it the strong wing that it had, they opted for deleting the hydraulics for a folding wing. And that's why the Dauntless didn't have a folding wing. But other than that, say it was obsolete or it was old or anything like that, I mean, it performed better than the Japanese Val dive bomber did. And some might consider that more modern, but it had fixed landing gear. It didn't have armor plate. It didn't have self-sealing tanks. Its armament was less than the Dauntless, and it could carry it couldn't carry as heavy a bomb load as the Dauntless.
I mean, that's the thing. A couple people have said in the sidebar there, massive, great wing. So it's obviously sturdy. It's obviously well built. And as we said, we may talk about some of the American torpedoes and their weaknesses later on. But in a sense, bombs have been a sort of a reliable technology by the time World War II comes around for a few decades. I mean, they're in principle, you drop it and a fuse will detonate either on impact or on some kind of timer. It's a fairly more basic bit of technology than a torpedo. And and the 500-pound bomb is pretty damn good, isn't it? So I mean, how did they? Was it simply the size bomb that was connected to what the aircraft could carry well, or was there some science behind what size bomb would do what? How did they kind of come up with the magic numbers in the sense of putting all this together?
I don't know how they came up with the magic number, but as aviation technology grew in the 1930s and aircraft carriers became more prominent, and aircraft like the Dauntless appeared, they basically just took the American standard Army Air Force bomb and adopted it for the Navy. Of course, they developed a semi-armor piercing and armor piercing bomb. But when you look at the explosive load of, say, 1,000-pound bomb from a Dauntless, and you take the weight of shell from a 16-inch gun from a battleship, the 1,000-pound bomb delivered more explosive power than a 16-inch shell hitting its target. And it was cheaper to do it with a Dauntless than having a giant battleship with 2,000 guys manning the ship to make it go. And the Dauntless was far more accurate. And so the explosive power of a single bomb as compared to a Navy shell was far greater. And of course, then again, you add in the accuracy of the Dauntless, and you get the results that we see in the Pacific War of this particular aircraft, sinking so many ships.
I mean, exactly. I mean, it does what it's supposed to do. I think that's the main thing. Is some of the very best kit from World War II. I was out filming today with JD from History Underground channel, and I was showing him the Churchill tank in Normandy. And the Churchill, it did one thing pretty well, and a few other things pretty well as well. Some things are too multi-purpose. They end up, in fact, I had an argument that the Spitfire, in a sense, gets weaker and weaker as the war goes on because they try and do more and more different things with it. And it was sort of better when they were just going to be kind of a one thing type of fighter. And I'm not going to go into talking about the Spitfire tonight because that's not what we're talking about. But it seems to me, if you can just identify what an aircraft is good at and keep on doing that simple thing, you kind of got a winner on your hands.
Yeah, and I have to say that the Dauntless is a great example of American ingenuity and manufacturing, because all the American, and I would say British aircraft, and to an extent the German aircraft too in the Second World War, they were all well built. They were tough airplanes. They were very, very tough. And so for the Dauntless, obviously a carrier-borne aircraft, it had to be built more ruggedly, just because of the nature of its role on an aircraft carrier, heavier landing gear, longer wings, that type of thing. So it was quite rugged, and also too because it was a mid-30s design. It wasn't, technically an advanced aircraft, i.e., compared to, say, the Helldiver with its hydraulics and electrical systems and things like that. It was far more sophisticated. But having said that, all that sophistication in the Helldiver didn't necessarily make it a better dive bomber.
Yeah, well, and that came up in the sidebar a few minutes ago. Someone said, what about the Helldiver? And because the two aircraft, similar jobs, similar roles, similar everything in many ways. But people have already commented about the teething problems of the Helldiver. And again, the Dauntless, it had been in service for a while. So by the time we get to kind of the Midway, Guadalcanal era at the midpoint of the war, they have been flying these things for a few years. So I guess the teething problems of the Dauntless have been ironed out. Were there any teething problems indeed when it first came into service? Or is that something that was ever an issue?
I wouldn't say teething problems. I would say the first production models, SBD1 and SBD2, probably the SBD1 was given to the Marines because it lacked the range to fly from carriers to be adequate for use on the aircraft carrier. SBD2 had more gas tanks, so it could fly longer, and it was issued to the Navy squadrons. But the aircraft, I think the aircraft that came before it, I think it was the BT-1, the Douglas BT-1. That's where they, encountered the teething problems, and it was never really a proper dive bomber in the sense of the way the Dauntless could dive at close to 80 degrees. So I think they overcame those problems in that design process of that aircraft, and when they designed the wholly new SBD dive bomber, those teething problems were addressed, especially with the flaps. When they decided to drill the 3-inch holes in the flaps, which gave it its distinct look when you see the back end of it, or the paintings of it in its full extended dive flaps, which gave its great stability in the dive, which with great stability comes greater accuracy. And so that's one of the reasons why, the Dauntless was as successful as it was. But if you compare the Dauntless to the Helldiver, yes, the Helldiver was faster. It could carry a heavier bomb load, and it could go farther. So those are all the things you want in the Navy aircraft.
Yep.
But if you had put the Helldiver on Guadalcanal in 42, starting in August and had it on Henderson Field, it probably wouldn't have been as successful as the Dauntless. And the reason is because of its sophistication. It had hydraulics, it had more electrics. Henderson Field was very primitive. Spare parts were hard to get. So the Dauntless is a more straightforward aircraft. And so in terms of maintenance and sortie rates, you got more out of that aircraft than you would have gotten with the Helldiver.
Yeah, that makes sense. We had exactly the same thing came up with Ben Kite yesterday about the Australian Air Force flying off New Guinea, the maintenance problems, the humidity. And again, with the Douglas, you know, because I mean, we could go back and look at various Douglas designs in the 20s and the 30s. That you can see that evolution. You can kind of see the aircraft refining, the styles get a bit better, the capacities, the bomb, everything gets better. And it's like the I'm going on to the ETO here, but the fact that when the Lancaster came up, the Lancaster was a improvement of the Manchester. Yeah, the Manchester had many shortcomings, but they could have thrown away the design completely and brought in something new. But what they did is we'd be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Say, look, we've got something that's intrinsically quite good here. We just need basically 4 engines rather than 2. And so I think it seems to me the Douglas is using some of that previous experience the company have had, and then they get this one aircraft that, as we said earlier, does the things it's supposed to do. But what about the pilots? We haven't talked about the pilots much so far, because if you're the kind of guy who is prepared to hurtle towards perhaps an enemy carrier in a dive bomber, you're a special kind of person. I'm not saying they're better than anybody else. I'm just saying it's a certain type of person. And people who fly Catalinas are brilliant pilots as well, and people who fly anything. But do they have much impact, pilots, in going back and steering how design changes can be made? Do they kind of give feedback to the manufacturer, so to speak?
Well, I didn't see a lot of that, but I think the pilots, you know, especially U.S. Navy and I guess all Navy pilots, are there for the challenge. I mean, you know, we've all read and heard and seen that, you know, basically a Navy pilot is basically better than an Air Force pilot just by the fact that you have to land on a small piece of wood in the middle of the ocean, and the pilot skill required to do that is extraordinary. And I think the you know, torpedo bomber pilots and the dive bomber pilots, you know, saw the challenge that was there and wanted to, you know, take that technique and improve on it. You know, I'm you know, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 41, of all the armed forces in the United States, it was the U.S. Navy that was the most prepared. You know, the Air Force was still trying to figure out what they're going to do. Strategic bombing. They didn't have any strategic bombers. And the Army was, I can't remember what the number was, but it was really small. But the Navy was ready. They had their carriers, they had their aircraft, they had their tactics and their techniques, and they knew what they wanted to do. And it was because of those pilots and their dedication to their craft that you know, played a large role in the early success of the Americans in the Pacific War.
No, definitely. And this is another thing, you know, the topics of discussion here, you know, it's participating in 5 of the carrier battles, all 5 of the carrier battles. And because we see other aircraft from World War II that are perhaps good in the early years, but have been completely surpassed by the later years, or ones that come in for a short period of time, and then the need for them kind of moves away because warfare's moved on. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Dauntless has a pretty long career, doesn't it? Sure, it's being outpaced as the war goes on, but it's got a longevity about it as well. And what would you just put it down to? Just because it's good at what it does, I suppose.
Yeah, it was good at what it could do, and it was available. And you know, if you're like purchasing an item, you knew what you were going to get. Yeah. And there weren't going to be any problems with it. Now, there were some things that you would wanted to improve on it. And they did that with the, you know, as they improved the aircraft, gave it a bit extra range and things of that nature. But basically, you knew what you were going to get, and it did its job, and it did it very well. It's like a good rifle, you know. You got a good rifle, there's nothing you really need to change. Now, having said that, of course, the carrier warfare, you know, changed after 43 as the new Essex carriers came into service, and you know, the U.S. Navy was about to strike in the Central Pacific. So, you know, range became an issue, bomb load became an issue, But other than that, there was nothing really you could say of the Dauntless that it couldn't do what it was asked to do. And
I think expanding on your point there is one of the things that I've had as a recurring kind of thought this last sort of 6 months, 8 year on World War II TV is the importance of us getting through the 1942, early 1943 period, because that is when everything is on a knife's edge. Every theater, in the air, on the sea, on the ground. By the time you get to 44, 45, and yes, as you say, the Americans have better carriers and there's now better fighters in place. There's better this, there's better radar, better torpedoes. The everything is more of everything fundamentally as well. But it's that 42 period where you need some kind of sense of stability because the situation is changing in every theater almost day to day. Look at the Mediterranean, look at North Africa, the ebbing and flowing back there in the desert there, and the Pacific. You know, you look at that kind of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway period where it's swinging back and forth as who's got the advantage. It seems to me, in sporting terms, as a football fan, soccer, you know, that we always talk about that first name on the team sheet. You know, you're a coach, you've got to pick your 11. Who's the first name on the team sheet? It seems to me in that 42 era, the Dauntless is kind of a good first name on the team sheet. It does what it's supposed to do, and it's kind of reliable, and it'll get that job done. And bridging that period from Pearl Harbor to the end of the war, when Americans have got more of everything, they have got better designs, is really important. And maybe why to some people, because new shinier aircraft come in later in the war, the Dauntless has kind of dropped off people's radar a bit, metaphorically and possibly literally as well, because of that later technology being a bit sleeker, a bit sexier. And it's time now to kind of, for those who don't appreciate this aircraft brilliance, kind of putting it back on the map and saying, you know what, it was doing everything it was supposed to do for those tricky couple of years in the middle of the war. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, totally. And I would add other aircraft as well. I mean, you know, the aircraft like the Spitfire and the P-51 and P-47 Thunderbolt and Corsair and aircraft of that nature seem to, you know, get all the romantic glory because of their performance and things of that nature. But when you look at 42, you know, the Americans are going into the war with what they had. So the most numerous fighter that they had in the Army Air Force was the P-40. And the most numerous fighter with the U.S. Navy was the F-4F Hellcat, or sorry, Wildcat. And also the P-39 era Cobra. So, you know, they're fighting against the Japanese and the vaunted, you know, Mitsubishi Zero, which, you know, has its own, you know, bracket of fame as
sort of mystique about it, doesn't it?
Yeah. Fighter, and it was the best, and P-40 was obsolete, and the P-39 was obsolete, and Wildcat was obsolete compared to the Zero. And in fact, they weren't. It was just finding a way to fight well with them. And those aircraft and the pilots and the tactics and all the things that were associated with it, you know, basically, you know, held the fort. They said, this is where the line is, and we're going to fight until, you know, our manufacturing gears up, our training gears up, and all we have to do is, you know, hold off the Japanese until our forces begin to build. And in fact, they, you know, the air combats, when you look at in 42 between the Wildcat and the P-40s and the P-39s, the numbers, you know, are pretty close. There's no one side. The Zero does not dominate totally and wipe out the Wildcats or the P-40s. You know, these guys managed to hang on. Now, the Japanese pilots had their own handicaps as well in fighting a war that, you know, as 42 rolled on, they weren't planning for. Like the Germans, they're planning for a quick, decisive campaign. We'll draw the American fleet into the Pacific. We'll have a decisive battle. We'll win, or we'll come to a stalemate, and that's how it will go. But once the Americans, you know, after Pearl Harbor, the Americans weren't idle. They started raiding Japanese islands with their carriers in March and in April. And the Doolittle raid is the most famous. Yep. So they were sending their carriers out there. They weren't doing heavy damage to the Japanese, but they were showing the Japanese that they were still around. We're going to fight, and we're going to come at you and do that. And the Dauntless place in that was that because of its success, it forced the Japanese to react to American moves. Because before that, the Americans were always reacting to what the Japanese were doing.
Yeah.
Now the Japanese had to go, oh, okay, well, we couldn't invade Port Moresby because of the Battle of Coral Sea, and we lost that. Or it was a victory for the Japanese in the sense of tactical victory, but a strategic victory for the Americans because it stopped the Japanese from invading Port Moresby. So then they had to change tack and say, okay, this has caused us to abandon our attempt at Port Moresby. We're going to have to do it again later, but we have to deal with the American fleet before we can do this. So then they decide, let's go draw the American fleet out with the Battle of Midway. So they're forcing the Japanese hand to do something they didn't want to do.
And that's a really good point, because all through our study of World War II, we get our information predominantly from the victors. The old adage of history is written by the victors, and that idea we have of the Zero, as you said, having this mystique, this reputation, this fear factor there. What we don't have from that era is Japanese accounts saying how terrified they were of the Dauntless, or in many cases, as a Normandy guy, you know, yes, Allied soldiers were terrified of the Tiger, Allied soldiers are terrified of the 88, but German soldiers are terrified of the 25-pounder. German soldiers were terrified of the Sherman Firefly. But because we learn our history from that American point of view, and with the Japanese particularly, because so few Japanese, relatively speaking, survived the war to tell us what their experiences were. If we could go back in time now and interview Japanese naval personnel on carriers or other capital ships in 42, 43, I bet a lot of them would say they were terrified of the Dauntless, and give us this idea of building up this. Its reputation for the Japanese was the same as the Allied fear of the Zero or the Kate or in the other theaters the Stuka, whatever it was. It's this again. It's danger of getting our history from the victor's point of view solely. But there's another. This kind of a kind of computer-generated graphic of a dive bomber screaming in there against the carrier. But that to me conveys that fear factor and the fear for the pilot and the fear for the people on the receiving end. But one of the next points you want to talk about is, I'm just talking about the Japanese, is the Japanese, of course, have air defenses. And I think we tend to look, those of us who don't understand naval history very well, I include myself in this, is that an aircraft carrier or a battleship is a battleship, and they're the same across the board. Well, of course, they're not. The different nations have different techniques of dealing with air attack. They have different weapon systems. They have different radar capabilities. So this is a point you wanted to bring up today. So yeah, the Dauntless was good, but how did the Japanese defenses play into its success?
Well, I think both the Americans and the Japanese realized that, in order to, get complete dominance of the air, you had to strike first, sink the enemy's aircraft carriers first, and then you would achieve that. And so the Japanese, based their doctrine on that. And so their carrier air defense was considerably weaker than the Americans and what the Americans' approach was, which I'll get into a little bit. But so the Japanese aircraft carriers, they had anti-aircraft guns, 4.5 inch, 5.5 inch guns in that range for long range. It was their short range weapons that were there was a deficit. They had 25 millimeter guns, either in twin mounts or triple mounts. They didn't have very many, and their fire control wasn't the greatest either. They didn't have radar, so they relied on the human eyeball and scouts scanning the horizon for airplanes, and they would use other ships, cruisers and destroyers, to basically, if you had a CAP, a combat air patrol flying, and a cruiser, a couple miles away from the carrier spotted enemy aircraft coming in, they would fire their main guns to signal the aircraft flying above that there was, enemy approaching. So they had no real way of communicating effectively to even fighters airborne that in what direction and what height the enemy aircraft were coming at. So that was a problem. And so even if they did have the detection, their anti-aircraft guns, and to a certain extent, the Americans suffered the same problem, was that, firing an anti-aircraft gun from a moving ship at a moving airplane is a very difficult task. And so you want to be able to spot the enemy as quickly as possible and engage. So in the terms of the Dauntless, they usually approached their target from 15, 12,000 feet in formation, and then once they got close to the target, they would move from the sort of V formation into echelon and begin their dives. And so if you didn't spot them before they started their dives and got some anti-aircraft fire on them or intercept by fighters, once they were in their dive, that was the most difficult time for any anti-aircraft gunner to engage the Dauntless. So with the Japanese armament being in the light range as far as their 25 millimeter gun, once the Dauntless was in the dive, the larger 4.5 guns of that range, they couldn't engage. They just couldn't get the fire control solution in time, because basically the Dauntless in a dive was there for about 30 seconds until it dropped its bomb. So you had to, if you are, say, the 25 millimeter gunner, if you had, 20 Dauntlesses in echelon diving on your carrier, you had 30 seconds in which to engage a single aircraft, because there was one right behind them. So if you have, 5 guns on one side of the aircraft carrier able to engage those diving aircraft, your chances of, getting all of them or hitting all of them are very slim. And you also have to, with those type of guns, because the weight of shell was so low, that you had to actually, shoot the airplane down, like destroy it before it dropped its bomb. So you needed a larger weapon in order to do that. Now, again, the time of the dive and the time you can get your gun to bear and shoot, how many rounds you would get off and how many accurate rounds you would get off would be very low. So for the Dauntless crews, that was, one of their advantages, one of the things that they didn't have to really, weren't too concerned about, but concerned enough. But the lightweight of the Japanese anti-aircraft fire was such that it gave the advantage to the Dauntless pilots.
And in sheer kind of just mathematical terms, if you've got, 10 aircraft, 10 Dauntlesses approaching an aircraft carrier, you kind of only need to get that one bomb in the one place. And that's 20 men. And even if all 10 aircraft get shot down, you lose those, all those crews. If you've sunk an aircraft carrier with one bomb, they are potentially able to completely change the course of a naval engagement with just one aircraft. I mean, if you fly a Spitfire against a Messerschmitt, maybe you shoot down 2 Messerschmitts. Maybe on a really good day, you shoot down 3 or 4. You've taken out 4 aircraft. A dive bomber can remove from battle a large ship. I mean, that is, as we know in Midway, that is an absolute game changer, isn't it?
Oh, it's extraordinary. But also, too, obviously the tactics for both navies was they wanted to, attack the surface ships simultaneously with torpedo bombers and dive bombers. There's only a few occasions where that actually happened, but I mean, when you think about it, if you have a simultaneous attack by dive bombers at wave top level and torpedo bombers at wave top level and dive bombers higher up, you're dividing your anti-aircraft guns as well, and so that means less weight of fire, less chance of negating an attack. So the Japanese were quite handicapped by that as well. Now, the Japanese, generally in terms of defending the fleet, they would assign 9 zeros for combat air patrol over the carrier per carrier. So you would have 3 zeros flying cap at any point above the fleet, 3 ready for immediate takeoff, and then 3 other zeros at a lesser state of readiness. So at any one time, say you had 2 aircraft carriers operating simultaneously, there'd be 6 zeros flying cap, but with no real good fighter control to get the message to the fighters that yes, there are planes over there, they're at 20,000 feet, go get them. A lot of the pilots had to rely on their own eyeballs and signals from the ships. And Japanese radios weren't the most reliable. And so they were greatly handicapped in that way. And, in the Battle of Midway, is the shining example of that was that when the Devastators and the, other torpedo bombers, I think there were 6 TBFs, began their torpedo runs on the Japanese carriers, the Japanese launched more of their fighters and basically drew far too many down to the low level where the Devastators were making their attacks. And so when the Dauntlesses arrived over the fleet, there was no way for the Japanese to engage the Dauntlesses, and they basically had a free dive.
Yeah, as we've kind of seen in the movies, essentially, which is, and we can talk about that. But next point is, which I was quite surprised at when you sent this through, lowest lost rate of all U.S. Navy aircraft in the Pacific, because this kind of seems counterintuitive. When again, I'm kind of thinking about the movie again and those screaming in there, that rate there. At that point, it does kind of seem like a suicide mission, and it does seem that your chance of getting out of that are against you. But overall, lowest loss rate.
I have to be probably a little bit more specific. Probably carrier aircraft.
Carrier, yeah, of course, carrier.
So the Dauntless had, like all bombers in the Second World War, every bomber was vulnerable to fighter attack. Didn't matter how many guns and turrets you put on the things. They needed, at the end of the day, they needed fighter escort. And it was the same. It was true with the Dauntless as well. It wasn't invulnerable, but it had some qualities that enabled it to keep its loss rates low. And part of it was obviously the armor plating that it had, self-sealing tanks that it had. It had the two 30 caliber machine guns for the rear gunner in the back with a pretty good rate of fire. And also, too, as I explained before, the best time to intercept the Dauntless was before its dive.
Yeah, on its way there, not out over target.
Yeah, because once it was in its dive, with the dive flaps out, it had a steady speed of about 240 in a dive, and it didn't really change. And if you had a Zero diving in from behind, the Zero was accelerating. It had no way to slow its speed down. So the diving Zero pilot would probably have a few seconds to get a snapshot off at the Dauntless, and then it would have to, pass by it because of its increasing speed. And then by the time the Zero pulled up, the Dauntless would have finished its bomb run, and it might have shot it down later, but the damage would have already been done. So that's what you want to do, is you want to destroy the aircraft before it gets a chance to. You either want to destroy the airplane or set off its aim so that the ordnance doesn't arrive on target. That's what you really want to do. And so after the Dauntless would finish its dive, it would be at way top level, and they would fly to the rendezvous point. It was vulnerable here, but the low level flying Dauntless at that height, the Zero couldn't quite get underneath it because of its height to shoot it at its most vulnerable point. And so it would have to rely on trying to get on top of the Zero or the Dauntless, and with a rear gunner there, it was a bit of a challenge. Also, too, with the rear gunner actually firing at the incoming fighter, you had another body in the back telling the pilot at what direction that fighter was coming in at. So that gave the pilot, the information he needed so that he could either do a skid, slight turn, just enough to throw off the Zero's aim. So that was a big advantage as well. Having that extra pair of eyes in the back of the plane gave the Dauntless pilot a great advantage, because it also, wasn't very often these guys got surprised.
Yeah,
playing behind them. Where in a fighter pilot, if you didn't see the guy behind you, you're toast. And a lot of pilots, perished because they never saw the other fighter that shot them down.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, lots of Dauntlesses were shot down, and many returned to the aircraft carriers riddled with bullets and, basically scrap, but they made it back. So that combination of the rear gunner, its inherent strength, armor plating, self-sealing tanks, and its ability to, maneuver gave the Dauntless a distinct advantage. Now, also, too, Dauntless pilots were smart, like most pilots, but they knew that their best defense was cloud cover.
Yeah.
If they saw some Zeros coming for them, they just said, "Well, there's a cloud. Let's go, get in there and hide," or form up with their other Dauntlesses in their V formation, with the center aircraft in the center and one on the side, and the other one stepped up or down on each side, depending on the commanding aircraft pilot's preference. So this gave them a good rearward firing package in terms of self-defense. So for the Zero pilot, it was a bit of a challenge, because the Zero didn't have armored glass on the cockpit for the pilot, and and without self-swing tanks, a single incendiary bullet in the fuel tank was all it took.
Yeah, and obviously the subject of your book is particularly about the combat between these two aircraft types there, and I found that photo of an air show to sort of illustrate the slide there. And it seems to me that when comparing these two aircraft, this isn't like your kind of classic comic book dogfight in the skies, like in the First World War of a Sopwith Camel against the Fokker or something, because it seems to me you've got to compare the whole doctrine and tactical approach of the two sides, because as you're going to explain, it's anti-aircraft both on ground or on ships. It's the radar, it's the altitude, the tactical approach there. So when you're comparing these two aircraft, you're comparing the whole infrastructure behind them, not just the aircraft type. That's kind of the point, isn't it? It's you can't compare them. It's not a card game where this one flies faster, this one is slow, this one wins. It's the whole package, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's training, it's doctrine, it's tactics, it's maintenance and serviceability. A lot of these battles, the aircraft come back and then they got to get ready for another strike. It's how can the maintenance crews and the deck personnel patch up the aircraft and do that. And if you look at the battle for Guadalcanal, the Japanese based at Rabaul, they had their problems as well. You could say oh, there was 100 Zeros on Rabaul, but how many were serviceable? Right? How many were actually ready for combat? And if you have an organization that can, have a better maintenance ability, then that adds to your overall fighting ability. So it's a combination of all those things. Is that if you have the supplies, you have well-trained mechanics, you have ammunition, and you have the ability to generate sorties again and again and again, you can have a handful of aircraft, but you can do a lot of damage.
That's exactly, interestingly enough, the point Ben Kite made last night about the Australian Kitty Hawks on New Guinea. Is they worked out every minute this aircraft is sitting on the ground not doing anything, it's a waste. We need them in the air all the time, so therefore we need to improve the servicing, the maintenance. We need to have more pilots in the squadron than we would normally have, so that when Fred lands, Jim takes it up again immediately, and you make it a force multiplier by keeping it in the air and keeping them out there active all the time. And these aspects are not always considered when you're thinking about this aircraft to aircraft comparison. It's again, how many hours in a day, how many missions, how many flights, how much training, where's your morale is another aspect as well. So that's important. But Guadalcanal, you've mentioned Guadalcanal a couple of times, and there's various things to talk about here, because obviously with the Dauntless, everybody's knowledge about it kind of is Midway is its kind of cup final in soccer terms. That's where kind of most people that have heard of it would think of it as its kind of crowning achievement, its moment in the spotlight. But Guadalcanal, which was a long campaign, it's obviously something you wanted to talk about, but the horrid conditions. This is one of your talking points there. We talked again with Ben yesterday about just dealing with malaria, and I think the Australian pilots saying they're dealing with dysentery, so everything's coming out both ends simultaneously all the time. So give us a bit of an idea about the conditions and how that affect, and did it lead to inefficiency?
Yeah, I mean, for both sides, I mean, these guys are fighting in tropical islands that basically no one lived on, and they had no real, intrinsic value as far as like the war in Europe, where you were fighting for a city or a town or a plot of land. Here you were fighting for an airfield, and these places were malaria infested, and food was a problem, and they suffered from dysentery and malaria and scabies and all kinds of skin conditions. And I can't even, list all the things that they would have to go through. And of course, suffering from that. And there's also morale, and there's also, being bombed daily by the Japanese, and flying every day off to bomb another Japanese ship, 200 miles from the canal. And, this affected efficiency. This has affected accuracy. I'm just, always amazed and surprised at the achievement that these guys were able to do on both sides. When you think about Japanese fighter pilots flying from Rabaul all the way to Guadalcanal, it's a 1,000-mile round trip over open ocean, and doing that every day, it was extraordinary. And then, like I said, the living conditions were such that their performance, and also too, the personnel suffered, but the aircraft suffered as well. So you go up in your Dauntless, and the bomb sight wouldn't work, or the guns would jam after the first round, or the bomb release would malfunction. So here was a target right in your gun sight, and you can't hit it. So things of that nature happened all the time. And so, again, you put all those factors in where the Americans were just able to get enough supplies and pilots and planes that, when you look at the campaign, it's like, a big battle was, they launched 30 Dauntlesses, right? Like 30. That was all. It's not, it's not 120, or it's not, anything like that. It's a small package of airplanes. It's not a great deal. And then and one of the reasons is because they couldn't, keep that many flying at any one time. So damage, shelling of the field, air attacks, again, and then of course efficiency of the pilots, and also to the efficiency of the maintenance crews, because they were suffering the same as the pilots.
Yeah.
So.
And I guess the only saving grace is that it said that the enemy are suffering from all the same conditions as well. So it's maybe it was an equalizing factor when you look at the grand scheme of things, and they're both dealing with it. But it brings it back to that point I made earlier about the importance of morale in that 42-43 year, and not more 42 than 43, because the tide has yet to turn in the Allies' favor, even though people would say Midway is a turning point, and it was, but there's still a lot of knife edge moments until we get to closer to the end of 43, when the defeat of the Japanese becomes really kind of expected, as opposed to hoped for in the previous that area there. So is there something you can kind of the light shed some light on how the pilots and the crews and the maintenance people got through that period? Is it just sort of self-belief and confidence that they're doing the right thing and they've got this ability behind them? Because they do know there's a whole navy out there sort of supporting them, and there's the logistics and the infrastructure there. So is it just kind of find again this spirit of a dive bomber being kind of a special kind of person, that it's that kind of self-belief get them through, I suppose?
I suppose there has to be a bit of that, but I think it's probably just dogged determinants. I mean, I would think that, morale would not be the greatest. But I think also too, the fact that the Japanese deliberately attacked Pearl Harbor played a factor into that. But I think at the same time, all human beings at a certain point, reach a point where they go, what am I doing here? What am I doing? Why am I doing this? This is I go up every day and nothing changes, but they stuck to it. And I think for, a lot of pilots and a lot of soldiers and airmen and Navy personnel, you somehow, get through it somehow. And I don't know how they did it.
And that's a really good point, because, again, we talk about Midway as being this crowning achievement, but Midway was pretty short battle, all things considered. I'm sure they were absolutely knackered at the end of it, but it's a bit different to spending weeks months as the American pilots did on Guadalcanal, the Australian pilots, because Australians are using their version of the Dauntless in the theater as well, New Zealand pilots as well. When you're on land on places like New Guinea or Guadalcanal, it's weeks, if not months of this. I mean, even if your motivation is high, there's a certain amount of repetitiveness of sort of same shit, different day, getting up. I've got dysentery again. We're going up there. We've been, Chris made the point in the sidebar there of the nightly bombardments of the airfield. So you're not sleeping properly. There's damage repair kind of daily. It's a long grind, isn't it? It's a long time to stay focused. Most people can kind of get themselves focused for the big game. Midway, I keep using my soccer analogies today, but Midway is the big game. People, you shouldn't need to be motivated for that big game. But the whole league campaign, I'm carrying on with my sporting analogies, whether people like it or not, is that's when you've got to dig deep, isn't it?
Yeah, and when you look at, say, as you said, you mentioned before, Midway being the turning point in the Pacific, it was a major battle and a part of a turning point, I would say, because after Midway there was 2 more carrier battles. Yeah, the Americans and the Japanese, Santa Cruz and the Eastern Solomons. So both sides still had aircraft carriers that they could use to duke it out. But I think the one advantage the American pilots had on Guadalcanal was that they were rotated out at a certain point. So as far as I know, for the Japanese, they didn't really have that kind of rotation system. Now, a lot of the American pilots were rotated out because they were just too ill. They couldn't fight. And others had spent their time there, and they said, okay, you can go out now because we're going to get some replacement pilots. And I think that was also key. Knowing that you weren't there forever, it helped. Now, and you've talked about the European War and stuff. And, for these guys, they didn't have anywhere to go. They couldn't, fly their Spitfire over the channel, shoot at some Messerschmitts, come back, land, go to the pub. They were stuck on Guadalcanal, fighting mosquitoes and dysentery and shitty food and all that boredom, and not knowing when it was all going to end, kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And the other thing we must address is the fact, you said it yourself earlier, is that things do change as the war goes on. Carrier tactics change, carrier design changes, technology changes. So kind of run us through the last couple of years for the Dauntless, because it's not a sad decline, but its importance does slightly drop off as the situation around it changes and the war changes course and we become the aggressors in the theater there. So kind of give us an idea about how things kind of progressed those last couple of years of the war for Dauntless pilots and the Dauntless aircraft.
So, as we move into 44, there's only 2 squadrons of Dauntlesses left during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. I think one's aboard the Enterprise, and I can't remember the other carrier, but there's basically 2 squadrons left in the fleet. There's also Marine Dauntlesses. But during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, this is the last sort of carrier operation with the Dauntless dive bomber. I think they do manage to sink a light carrier during the battle, but it's basically come to its end as far as a useful Navy aircraft. One of the big drawbacks is its wings don't fold and doesn't have the range. And so the new Essex carriers are coming on stream, and also to the new light Independence class carriers are coming on stream. And because they can't fold the wings, you can't put as many on the light carrier and you can't put as many on the Essex carrier. And what you want to do is load up as many airplanes as you possibly can get on the aircraft carrier. So the Dauntless is being replaced by the Helldiver, which has a greater range, speed, bomb load, etc., folding wings, more planes. But what else is starting to happen is that the role of the dive bomber is starting to change. And what the Navy is finding is, yeah, we can strap 2,000 pounds of bombs on a Hellcat or a Corsair, and it can go farther. And once it drops its bombs, it can be a fighter again. It has a heavier armament, so for strafing and stuff like that. So the fighter becomes more of a multi-role aircraft: interceptor, air superiority fighter, ground attack, and ship killer. So the Navy starts to realize that, if we have more fighters, we have more flexibility and more striking power. So what happens is, as they move into 44 into 45, they begin to lessen the number of dive bombers on their carriers. And so what happens is, say in 44, you had 40 Hellcats and 25 dive bombers and 18 torpedo bombers. You now have 65 Hellcats, 18 dive bombers, and 14 torpedo bombers. So that ratio begins to change because the fighter becomes a more flexible weapon system and more effective. So the era of the dive bomber is slowly coming to an end as we progress through into 44 into 45.
Which means, of course, we've talked about it on other shows, is that people remember the stuff that we had at the end of the war. It's like veterans, if they've done a 4-year campaign, when they come out of the service, the stuff they tend to remember better is the stuff they've just experienced because it's fresh. And the stuff from 2 years earlier, 3, 4 years earlier is a bit of a blur because you've been doing it. And, when we come out and you think of things like victory parades and fly pasts and things like that were happening in 45, 46, and the people coming home with their VE Day or VJ Day, special edition Life magazines, this, that, and the other. The kind of aircraft getting in the headlines then are going to be the Corsairs and the B-29s and things like that, because you're obviously going to be putting in the stuff that was finishing the war, not the stuff that had helped us get to that point where we could finish the war back, as we said earlier, in those darker days of 41, 42, when the world was in absolute peril. So it's a shame really the Dauntless didn't kind of get to be part of that victory. It helped earn the victory, but it kind of wasn't there really to sort of celebrate the final chapter, which is a bit of a shame really.
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about it earlier today. Let's say, the Dauntless had a film crew on Guadalcanal following, a particular Dauntless that had completed 25 missions and was celebrated and brought back to the States and did a bond tour and things like that, where the Memphis Belle is the obvious example. The Air Force had a better, I don't say they had a better PR, but if you look at the conditions on Guadalcanal, the last thing you're going to send is, a film crew, because that's more mouths to feed, and where are you going to put them? And we don't want you here. And so, the Dauntless wasn't part of that publicity machine as much as, say, the B-17 or the P-51 or other aircraft. And that's just, fate, luck.
I say some of it's just luck, isn't it? That moment the photographer is there that captures that particular figure or that particular incident or a flag raising or a clearance of a particular enemy position or a victory or someone landing after doing something. Press just happened to be there. Public get interested in it. That guy goes on the war bonds, and that leaps off. It was amazing when James M. Scott, talking about the Doolittle raid, said on Monday's show how a signed poster by Jimmy Doolittle went for $4 million. I think it was some kind of raffle thing where people paid in to buy a ticket. $4 million in for it, and not that's in currency then. 55 million today it would be worth. And you think how the hell. We can't comprehend how famous Jimmy Doolittle was in 42. I mean, it's mind-boggling. He was Elvis, the Beatles, Magic Johnson, and Babe Ruth rolled into one in that era there. He was the most famous human being in the USA. And you look part of it is PR, isn't it?
Yeah, and you look at the Dauntless record, it's, in 42 alone, they, sank or helped sink 6 aircraft carriers, I think 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 5 or 6 destroyers, 14 transport ships. They're, and also too, you have to remember the American torpedoes at the beginning of the war were shitty. The Mark 13, it was like it had a 10% or 15% success rate. So if you just inverse the ratio of torpedo bombers to dive bombers in the U.S. Navy, we're talking about a different war.
Yeah,
I mean. The fortunes of war are such that the Dauntless was there and able to take advantage of some of the situations it was in to sink the Japanese carriers at Midway and at Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz and Battle of the Philippine Sea, because if you had relied on the Avenger torpedo bomber with the Mark 13 torpedo, it was it would have been a different story. Midway
would have been still out there trying to fight the war today. I think it would be lying on top. I mean, as we said earlier, all nations were having problems with torpedoes throughout the war.
So it was fortunate that the U.S. Navy had the Dauntless. It was a great airplane. They had good, well-trained crews. The bombs worked, and then you add in the fortunes of war and fate, and Dauntless was at the right time at the right place. Just like the Spitfire and the Hurricane,
exactly.
The right time in the right place to do the job that they did. But at the same time, as we discussed before, it's all part of a larger package. It's just not the airplane itself.
It's the doctrinal approach and the whole gamut there. But just because we've got people watching, not just from the USA, we've got people watching from New Zealand and Australia. We have to mention the fact that the USA was not the only aircraft nation to fly the Dauntless. In your research for your book, did you look at the other nations using it, or dive bombing basically with other nations?
Well, the New Zealanders had a squadron that they were equipped with Dauntlesses for a short period of time, and I think they later converted to Corsairs. They would spend most of their time in the New Guinea part of the Pacific, attacking Japanese bases near Rabaul and places like that. The French used the Dauntless in Europe with the French, is it the 7th Army? Am I correct in that? It was the French army attached to the American 7th Army in the south of France, right?
Yeah, there have been I forget which unit it was, but yeah.
Well, the Dauntless was used in the European theater as well, but not a lot of is written about that. I'm sure there's probably French sources that have more detail, but apparently they were very effective against the Germans. So, I think French, New Zealanders. I don't think the Australians were ever equipped with the Dauntless. I know they were given Vindicators.
Yeah, I think the Vindicators they had. Yeah, I think someone will correct us if we're wrong on that. But, okay. So we will kind of. I've really enjoyed tonight's talk. It's been really fascinating. But just to kind of finish off there, you're in some pub. You're in there with like 20 aviation historians. They've all got their aircraft that they are championing there, and you've got your closing statements. You've got to make your 3 points, let's say, to kind of, and then the audience are going to vote on their best aircraft. So someone's done the Lancaster, someone's done the Mosquito, the C-47, someone's argued for that, someone's taken on the Fairey Swordfish. It's your turn now to kind of big up the Dauntless. I know you've written about other aircraft as well, but what would your 3 points be? What would your, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I leave you this.
Mm-hmm. Well, if it wasn't for the Dauntless in the Pacific War would have been a very different war. Its ability to be a steady, reliable aircraft, the fact that it sank 4 carriers at Midway is extraordinary. The other, and I would say more decisive battle, and the turning point for the Pacific, was the Battle of Guadalcanal.
Yep.
And its role in that battle was probably even more decisive because it was able to sink Japanese transports getting to the island, forcing the Japanese to use destroyers at night in order to supply the island, which they were never able to do well enough. And the battle in November, when the Japanese decided to do it one more time, they sent, I think, 14 transports escorted by about 10 destroyers down the slot, as they call it, the passageway down to Guadalcanal. And the Dauntlesses from the Enterprise and Dauntlesses from Guadalcanal were able to sink, I'm not entirely certain on the figure, but at least 10 of the transports and 5 of the destroyers, and basically ended any hope the Japanese had of winning the Battle of Guadalcanal. And then from that point forward, the Americans were able to go on the offensive and defeat Japan. And if without the Dauntless, it would have been very different.
You've got my vote, Donald. I mean, that's very well explained and very well argued there. And I'm not going to disagree with you. And because it would be inappropriate. It seems logical to me. And again, a theme that has been in my head recently on show, I did a whole week about the Australian World War II, the loss, the the Japanese losing their transports in 42, 43 was a real turning point. We talk about carriers being lost. We talk about those big moments that are kind of sexy in terms of public opinion, but the fact that the Japanese by a certain point in the war are using submarines to resupply troops on their islands, you're taking, I said the exact same thing to Ben Kite last night, you're taking something from your aggressive anti-shipping aspect of your war and you're using a submarine to get to supplies to islands is a sign of massive weakness of what's happening with the Imperial Japanese Navy. You're because A, you can't put, it's a waste of a submarine, and B, you can't put many supplies anyway. And all those losses of those, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea that Michael Veach talked about on my channel a few weeks ago, where however many X number of Japanese transports were lost. You just talked about the loss of transports and destroyers there. That story alone, I think, has been lost because of the loss of carriers, because carriers seems on the surface to be so much more significant. And of course, we had movies about that. But transport, removing Japan's ability to transport supplies to its empire is critical, isn't it? Absolutely vital to the winning the war.
And also, just a sort of a final point as well is that the battle for Guadalcanal was both a naval and a naval, army, and air battle.
Yeah,
and this was the first time the Japanese were defeated on all three levels. Now there were battles around Guadalcanal which the Japanese did win, cruiser night battles and things of that nature, and were quite dominant. But at the end, the Japanese had been defeated both on the sea, the air, and on the land, and that was a major blow to the Japanese.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think we will leave things there. But just before we end, what are your projects right now? What's new for you in terms of aviation? What's the next book going to be? Because you make documentaries and things as well. You do a whole raft of things. What are you working on at the moment?
Well, right now I just finished a book for Osprey, and it's detailing the history of the 8th Air Force.
Okay,
as you know,
topical, yeah.
Spielberg and Tom Hanks are doing a new series on the Mighty 8th, Masters of the Air, I think it's called.
Yeah.
So that's going to sort of be in conjunction with the release of the series. So what my job was to take the existing Osprey library, all their books that they have, and go through that information and create a narrative about the 8th Air Force and its role in Europe. So lots of maps, aircraft profiles, diagrams, things of that nature. I got some new stuff that I dug up from a report I found at the archives, some images that had never been reproduced before. So it's going to be a pretty thick tome of material. So if you've bought the individual Osprey book on your favorite particular aircraft, a lot of that material that if you're interested in other aircraft is going to be in this volume as well.
Well, I'm going to invite you to come back and talk about that when that's ready, because I'm sure that when that series finally airs, I will be capitalizing on its success and bringing in, I do know Donald Miller a little bit, who wrote the book, Marcia. I know John Orloff, who's the screenwriter of the show. So I'm going to try and call in some favors and bring people to talk about, because we will be talking about the 8th Air Force. That will be the buzzword of the next couple of years. It will do for the 8th Air Force what Band of Brothers did for the 101st and the Pacific did for the Marines in the Pacific, and so we're looking forward to that. But right now I'll just remind folks what we've got coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So folks, we have one more show that I'm sneaking in as the last show of Aviation the Pacific Week tomorrow with John McManus. In fairness, he will be talking about the island hopping and the army on the ground as well, but of course we will touch on air power. John McManus, when he writes about the Pacific, is always bringing in the three elements: air, sea, and land. And so although we'll talk about the release of his second volume of his book, we'll bring in air power on that. And then next week, I put the shows up on YouTube yesterday. We've got 5 brilliant shows coming up about Italy in World War II, including battles you will literally have never heard of before. We talk about them next week, with the Italian invasion of Greece in 1940. I've got a wonderful historian coming on next Friday talking about the bombing of Italy. It'd be brilliant. Her book is fantastic about that. So looking forward to that. Then after that, we are acknowledging the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor with a special set of shows about that. And then it's Battle of the Bulge, and then Christmas, and lots more stuff. So as usual, folks, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Consider becoming a patron. A couple of new patrons today. Thank you very much for your support. Share what we're doing with your friends and World War II buffs. As I said before, the link to Donald's book is in the description below. There's a whole series of books he's written for Osprey and other people. His website details in the description below. Go out there and look at what he's been doing in the past. But right now, it just remains me to say thank you very much, Donald, for joining us. And did you enjoy it?
Yeah, that was great.
Brilliant. Well, there we are.
Yeah.
So we're into the weekend. So, folks, this is Paul Woodard for World War II TV. I will see you all again tomorrow for the show with John McManus, and then next week with Italy at War. And so thank you very much for joining us. Have a good weekend. I'll see you again. Cheers, everybody. Bye.